The moon hung low over Briar Hollow, casting an eerie glow on the rows of houses decorated for Halloween. Paper skeletons swayed in the breeze. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered on porches, and children in costumes scurried between homes, their laughter and excited shouts filling the crisp autumn air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its sound swallowed by the wind. "It's just another Halloween," Hannah told herself as she slipped into her jacket. She had heard that same dog barking for the past few nights, always at dusk, always from the direction of the old construction site. Probably chasing after squirrels or something. She made her way downstairs where her father, Sheriff Robert Harper, was sitting at the kitchen table, leafing through paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his stern face softening. "You headed out with your friends?" "Yeah, just gonna check out the barn party. I'll be home by midnight." She grabbed her phone and keys, avoiding his glance, knowing he'd probably warn her not to stay out too late. "Just be careful, kiddo. You know how rowdy it can get on Halloween." "Don't worry, Dad," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd been feeling off lately, nervous, like something was wrong but just out of sight. Maybe it was the cold creeping in or just the usual teenage angst, but tonight it felt stronger. He must have noticed her unease because he added, "I'll check in on you later." She waved him off and headed out the door, the crisp air nipping at her face. The streets were alive with costumed kids and parents trailing behind, but there was a stillness beneath it, like the town was holding its breath. Hannah couldn't shake the feeling. As she made her way toward the barn on the edge of town, her father received a call at the station. "We got a report about something strange up by the old construction site." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Robert sighed, reaching for his hat. "I'll check it out," he muttered, grabbing his flashlight and heading to his cruiser. He knew the place, abandoned after a series of strange accidents. No one had been up there in months. The site was a good 20 minutes from town, a half-finished development that had become overgrown with weeds and twisted vines. As Robert drove closer, the road narrowed, trees pressing in like skeletal hands. He felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. Something about this place had always unsettled him, but he couldn't place why. His headlights cut through the darkness, revealing heaps of dirt, rusting equipment, and something else. He parked the cruiser and got out, scanning the area with his flashlight. At first glance it looked deserted, just like always. But as he ventured further into the site, he saw it. Large, gaping holes in the ground. They were unnatural, too round, too deep. Robert knelt beside one, shining the light inside. The holes seemed to go on forever, a tunnel of darkness. He leaned closer, and that's when he heard it. A faint, skittering sound, like thousands of tiny legs moving beneath the earth. His skin crawled. Suddenly, a gust of wind kicked up, sending dead leaves and dirt swirling around him. He stood up quickly, heart racing. The wind died as quickly as it had come, but the sense of being watched lingered. Robert swept his flashlight over the site again, this time spotting something. Thin, sticky strands glinting in the moonlight, stretched across a nearby pile of rocks. He crouched down, running a finger through the substance. It was a web, but not like any he had ever seen. It was thicker, stronger. What the hell? Meanwhile, across town, Hannah and her friends had made it to the barn. It was rundown but perfect for a Halloween party. Isolated, spooky, and far from the prying eyes of adults. Music blared, and a crowd of teenagers packed inside, laughing, drinking, and dancing. Hannah joined her friends, but her mind was elsewhere. The odd sensation she had felt earlier wouldn't leave her. "Hey, you okay?" Luke asked, nudging her with his elbow. He was dressed in a cheap vampire costume, plastic fangs and all. "Yeah, just a little tired," she lied, offering him a weak smile. Luke grinned and leaned closer. "Well, maybe you just need a drink." His words cut off suddenly as he winced, his hand shooting to his neck. "Ow, something bit me." Hannah glanced at the small red welt forming on Luke's neck, the skin raised and angry looking. "Looks like a spider bite," she said with a casual shrug. But as the words left her mouth, something tugged at the back of her mind, pulling her attention to the barn's dark corners. The dim string lights draped along the rafters only illuminated the center of the space, leaving the edges of the barn swallowed in shadow. Her gaze lingered on those pockets of darkness where the light refused to reach, and her breath hitched. It was too quiet. A cold shiver trickled down her spine, the kind of chill that makes your skin prickle, like something or someone was watching from those shadows, waiting. For a brief, unsettling moment, the party around her seemed to drift away. Muffled laughter, music fading into an eerie hum, as if the barn existed somewhere else, apart from the rest of the world. The sounds of celebration became distant, almost dreamlike, and in that hollow silence, all she could hear was the soft rustling of the wind outside and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rapid clicking of tiny feet. Probably just nerves, she told herself, but her eyes kept flicking to the shadows, half expecting to see something crawling out of them. Luke, oblivious, rubbed the bite absent-mindedly. "It's nothing," he muttered. But Hannah noticed the way his fingers twitched against his neck, the way his eyes didn't quite focus when he looked at her. He stumbled slightly, and she caught his arm. "You okay?" Her voice was light, but her heart pounded in her chest. There was something wrong, something off about the way he was standing, the way his body seemed to sag as though something unseen was pulling him down. Yeah. He waved her off weakly. "Maybe I'm just coming down with something." His voice was slower than usual, as if he had to drag the words out of his mouth. His face, usually bright and full of energy, looked pale, drained of life. His bloodshot eyes blinked sluggishly, almost like they were struggling to stay open. As the hours slipped by and the party started to wind down, Hannah kept stealing glances at Luke. His movements had become slower, more awkward, as if his limbs no longer obeyed him. At first, she thought it was exhaustion, or maybe the alcohol finally hitting him, but now she wasn't so sure. He hadn't been drinking much, and his condition seemed to be getting worse, much worse. When the last few people left the barn and the cold night air swept inside, she finally noticed it. The veins, dark, jagged lines snaked out from the bite on his neck, spreading across his pale skin like creeping shadows, curling down his jawline towards his collarbone. The veins were swollen, bulging under his skin like black roots taking hold, twisting their way across his flesh in grotesque patterns. Her stomach flipped, and she instinctively took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. His skin looked too tight, as though it was stretched thin over his bones, his veins pushing against the surface, writhing, as if something inside was trying to break free. "Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. "Maybe you should go home." But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her, his mouth slightly open, his eyes distant, unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing her anymore. And then, slowly, his gaze shifted. His eyes met hers, and what she saw in them made her blood run cold. It wasn't Luke anymore. His eyes, once familiar and warm, were hollow now, empty. There was no recognition in them, only hunger, a primal, mindless hunger that chilled her to the bone. He blinked slowly, his eyelids heavy, but beneath them, something shifted. His pupils were dilating and contracting unnaturally, twitching like they were no longer under his control. "Luke?" She called his name again, but this time there was no answer, no acknowledgement, just that empty, ravenous stare. Outside, the air was oppressive, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. Hannah shivered, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the weight of the silence. The town had been bustling when they arrived at the barn. Music, laughter, people shouting and celebrating. But now, as she helped Luke outside, it was as if the entire world had gone still. The houses in the distance were dark, the streets empty, and even the wind seemed to have died down. The night itself felt heavier, like it was pressing in on her from all sides, suffocating her with an unseen weight. She guided Luke to the sidewalk, her heart racing. Every few steps, he stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him as if his body no longer remembered how to walk. His skin felt unnaturally cold when she touched him, and his breathing had become shallow, ragged. That's when she heard it, a faint skittering sound, barely audible, but unmistakable. She froze, her grip tightening on Luke's arm. The sound came again, closer this time, like the rustling of tiny feet moving rapidly through the darkness. Her head whipped around, scanning the empty street, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows, stretching long and deep in the dim light of the street lamps. And then Luke's head twitched violently, his whole body jerking as if something inside him had snapped. He collapsed to the ground, convulsing, his limbs flailing wildly as the dark veins pulsed beneath his skin, growing thicker, more pronounced. Hannah stumbled back as she watched in horror. The skittering grew louder. Far across town, at the abandoned construction site, Sheriff Robert Harper's flashlight flickered once, then twice, before plunging him into darkness. He cursed under his breath, smacking the flashlight against his hand, but the beam didn't return. The darkness was thick, oppressive, swallowing him whole. He could hear the wind howling through the trees, but beneath it, something else. Something that sent a chill into his bones. The movement. That skittering sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from below the earth. It was all around him. Robert's breath quickened as he turned in a slow circle, his heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't see them, whatever they were, but he could feel them. Eyes watching him. Tiny legs moving just out of sight, crawling, creeping. His grip tightened on his gun as his eyes darted around the site, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The sound was closer now, surrounding him. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A flash of movement, something dark and fast darting across the ground. His breath caught in his throat, and he whipped around, shining his useless flashlight in the direction of the noise. But there was nothing there. Only the gaping holes in the earth and the unsettling stillness of the night. The early morning light barely touched Briar Hollow. Thick clouds had rolled in, casting a dull gray over the town that matched the somber mood hanging in the air. The usual bustle of a town waking up for the day was oddly subdued. Doors stayed shut, curtains drawn tight. Only a few people ventured out, most moving quickly, heads down, as if something unseen lingered in the air. Hannah sat beside Luke's hospital bed, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her phone, mindlessly checking the same news updates over and over. Nothing. No word on what had happened the night before. No mention of the horrific transformation she had witnessed. She could still see it clearly, Luke's skin tearing, those black veins pulsing like something alive beneath the surface. It haunted her every time she closed her eyes. The hospital lights above buzzed softly, but to her, the sound felt like nails on a chalkboard, grating against her already frayed nerves. Luke hadn't spoken since they had arrived at the ER. He hadn't moved either. His body lay still, covered by a blanket that seemed too thin for the icy cold seeping into the room. His skin had turned a sickly pale, almost translucent, with the veins still visible beneath, though they had stopped spreading for the moment. But the worst part wasn't what she could see. It was the way the air around him felt, charged with something she couldn't describe, like the room was filled with an invisible web, and she was caught in it. "Do you think he'll wake up?" A voice broke the silence, causing Hannah to jump. It was Nurse Bentley, a woman in her late 50s with a kind but tired face, standing at the foot of the bed, flipping through Luke's chart. She frowned, her eyes flicking between the lines of notes with a growing unease. "I don't know," Hannah replied quietly, her voice almost a whisper. What's wrong with him? Was the question she wanted to ask. But the fear of knowing the answer held her back. Nurse Bentley glanced at Luke's lifeless form, her brow furrowing. "We've seen a few other cases come in with similar symptoms overnight. Fever, seizures, those strange markings on the skin. Doctors are baffled." She paused, lowering her voice. "We're isolating them, just in case." Hannah's chest tightened. Other cases? Her mind raced. Had it spread beyond Luke? How? When? The last thing she remembered clearly was dragging him from the barn, hearing that faint, horrible skittering sound as they stumbled into the street. She hadn't noticed anyone else that night. But now she wondered how many had been infected without even knowing. As if reading her thoughts, Nurse Bentley added, "I wouldn't worry too much, dear. Could be a virus. Some kind of strange infection. These things happen." Her smile was meant to be comforting, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, something she couldn't hide. "I'll leave you to it. If anything changes, just hit the call button." The door clicked shut softly behind the nurse, leaving Hannah alone with the faint beeping of the heart monitor and the low, labored sound of Luke's breathing. She swallowed hard, her eyes drifting back to his face. His lips had cracked overnight, small flecks of dried blood on the corners, his breathing ragged and shallow. He hadn't moved since collapsing. She sat back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The barn, the shadows, that bite. Her mind kept returning to the moment it all started. The way Luke's skin had changed, how the veins had spread like tendrils. The world outside felt far away, as though reality itself was fraying at the edges, unraveling in front of her. Every small sound in the hospital, the clicking of heels down the hall, the distant murmur of voices, only heightened her sense of isolation. What is happening? Her phone buzzed on her lap, startling her out of her spiraling thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. Her father. She swiped to answer, pressing the phone to her ear. "Dad?" "Hannah." His voice was rough, strained. "You at the hospital?" "Yeah, with Luke." She hesitated. He's not getting better. They said there are others." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, she thought she had lost the connection. Then her father spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I know. I've been following the reports. Whatever's going on, it's spreading fast. Have you found anything? What about the site?" She didn't even realize how tightly she was gripping the phone until her fingers started to ache. "Hannah, I don't even know how to explain it. We found more of those tunnels, bigger than the ones I saw last night. And the webs, they're everywhere. Whatever's down there, it's not normal." Her pulse quickened. The darkness in the barn, the skittering sound, the way Luke had changed. It was all connected. She knew it. But what? "Dad, you have to..." Her words cut off as Luke suddenly shifted, his body twitching under the blanket. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Dad, I have to go." "Hannah, wait." But she had already hung up, dropping the phone as she leaned forward, her eyes locked on Luke's face. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing bloodshot eyes that gleamed in the dim light. For a moment, they were his eyes, dazed and confused. Then they changed. His pupils contracted to pinpricks, then widened again. His breathing growing more labored, chest heaving. His mouth twitched, lips curling into a snarl. "Luke," she whispered, taking a cautious step toward the bed. His head jerked violently to the side, and his arm shot out, clawing at the blanket. Hannah stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat as she watched in horror. The veins beneath his skin bulged grotesquely, shifting like something alive. His fingers twitched, then clenched, his nails scraping against the metal bed railing with a sickening screech. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes found hers, dark, hollow, and filled with a hunger that was no longer human. "Help!" The word barely escaped his lips, more of a guttural rasp than a plea. And then his body convulsed, back arching off the bed, the veins along his throat throbbing violently as the skin stretched taut over his bones. The room filled with the sound of wet, tearing flesh. Hannah screamed, scrambling back as Luke's body began to contort. His skin split open in places, revealing something black and glistening beneath. Something that moved, squirming under the surface. His arms flailed wildly, knocking over the IV stand, and his legs kicked out as the transformation overtook him, twisting him into something grotesque, something other. His mouth opened wide, too wide, and a sickening gurgle escaped as spider-like limbs began to erupt from his sides, tearing through his flesh with sickening ease. His body convulsed one final time before going completely still. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Hannah stood frozen in the corner, her back pressed against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but watch as the thing that had once been Luke lay motionless on the bed, its spider-like limbs twitching in the air. Then, the skittering sound began again, louder this time, closer. It was coming from inside the walls. Hannah's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she ran down the empty hospital corridor, the echo of her footsteps reverberating off the cold, sterile walls. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum, the sound too loud, too present in the overwhelming quiet of the building. The distant beeping of machines, faint cries from unseen patients, and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights all felt muffled, as though the hospital itself was holding its breath. Behind her, the door to Luke's room creaked, a slow, agonizing sound. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. Whatever Luke had become, whatever had burst through his skin, wasn't human anymore. It had been crawling, convulsing, and mutating before her eyes, and now the echoes of its wet, guttural sounds haunted her every step. The halls stretched endlessly, the doors to other rooms closed, sealed off as if the rest of the hospital had already given up hope. Her phone buzzed in her hand, the screen lighting up with her father's name. She answered quickly, her voice shaky. "Dad." "Hannah, you need to listen to me." Robert's voice came through, low and urgent, barely masking the panic beneath. "You have to get out of there. It's not just the hospital. They've spread. The tunnels, they're everywhere. I found their nest. It's bigger than anything we could have imagined." Her stomach twisted. She had thought it was just Luke, that whatever had happened was isolated, contained to the hospital, maybe the town. But now, with her father's voice vibrating with fear, the scale of it hit her. "How many?" she asked, even though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Hundreds, maybe more. It's all connected. They move together, Hannah. It's like they're a single mind, a hive. We've only been seeing the small ones, the scouts. The Queen is what we need to stop." "The Queen?" Hannah's voice trembled. She leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself. The floor beneath her seemed to pulse, as if something massive shifted beneath the earth, moving closer. Robert's breathing was heavy, ragged. "There's a nest at the old construction site near the forest. It's where they're breeding, where the eggs are coming from. If we don't stop it tonight, this won't just stay in Briar Hollow. It'll spread. Fast." A cold sweat dripped down the back of her neck. The skittering she'd heard inside the walls, the flashes of movement. She had felt it creeping closer, tightening around her like a web. Now, hearing her father's words, the sense of doom pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. "Dad," she whispered, gripping the phone tighter. "I'm coming to you." "No," his voice was sharp. "You stay away from this. It's too dangerous. I don't—" He cut off, and all she could hear was the crackling of static and something faint in the background. A noise that wasn't him. "Dad?" She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the screen in horror as the call disconnected. The low battery warning flashed, and before she could dial him back, the phone went dark in her hands. She stood there, alone in the hallway, her mind racing. Her father was out there, alone, facing God knows what. And Luke, or what had been Luke, was somewhere behind her, crawling through the hospital walls like a grotesque mockery of a human being. She had to get to the construction site. She had to help him. Hannah pushed herself off the wall and sprinted toward the hospital exit, her heart pounding, the distant sound of skittering claws growing louder with every step. As she burst through the double doors into the parking lot, the cold air hit her like a slap, the sharp scent of damp earth filling her nostrils. The streets of Briar Hollow were eerily quiet, deserted, as if the entire town had already succumbed to whatever nightmare had been unleashed. She raced to her father's old Jeep, fumbling with the keys, her fingers trembling as she jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she tore out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The road ahead was dark, illuminated only by her headlights, casting shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. As she neared the outskirts of town, her thoughts spiraled, pieces of the puzzle coming together in horrifying clarity. The construction site, where it all started. The tunnels her father had mentioned. The way the Spiderlings moved, coordinated, as though driven by a single, malevolent intelligence. The Queen. The idea of it sent chills through her. If they didn't stop this hive, if they didn't kill the Queen, there would be no saving Briar Hollow, or anywhere else. The forest loomed ahead, dark and oppressive, the trees casting jagged shadows over the narrow dirt road leading to the abandoned construction site. She turned onto the path, her heart in her throat. The skittering sound was louder now, not just inside her head but real, all around her, as though thousands of tiny legs were crawling just beneath the surface of the earth. The Jeep's headlights swept over the site, revealing the half-finished structures and piles of rusting equipment. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the web. Thick, glistening strands of it stretched from the trees to the skeletal remains of the buildings, forming a vast, pulsating cocoon that shimmered in the early morning light. And at the center of it all, something massive shifted, its grotesque form hidden within the shadows of the webbing. Hannah's stomach turned at the sight of it. The Queen. She could feel it in her bones, a sickening primal sense of dread that made her skin crawl. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something ancient, dark, and deeply wrong. She slammed the Jeep into park and climbed out, her eyes fixed on the grotesque mound of webbing in the center of the site. Her father was here, somewhere. She just had to find him. "Hannah!" His voice called out from the far side of the nest, desperate and breathless. She turned toward the sound and ran toward him, her feet pounding against the uneven ground, dodging the webbing that seemed to reach out for her like grasping fingers. She found him near the mouth of one of the tunnels, covered in dirt, his face pale and streaked with blood. He was holding a rifle, his hands shaking as he pointed it at the nest. "I thought I told you to stay away," he said, his voice cracking with a mixture of relief and fear. "I couldn't," she replied, her voice barely steady. "I couldn't leave you." Robert nodded, his eyes fixed on the massive shape in the center of the webbing. "It's in there," he said grimly. "The Queen. If we can kill it, we might stand a chance. But if we don't—" He didn't have to finish the sentence. The weight of what was at stake hung heavy between them. Hannah grabbed a nearby metal rod, her knuckles white as she held it tightly. Together, they moved toward the center of the nest, their steps slow, deliberate. The air was heavy with tension, every breath a struggle as the skittering noise grew louder, more frenzied, like the creatures could sense their approach. And then they saw it. The Queen. Massive, bloated, its body pulsating with life. Hundreds of tiny spiderlings crawling over its slick black surface. Its eyes, too many to count, gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the light in an unnatural, menacing glow. Long, spindly legs twitched as it shifted, the sound of its movement sending ripples through the webbing. For a moment, neither of them moved, paralyzed by the sheer horror of it. Then Robert raised the rifle, his hands steady now, his eyes locked on the Queen's bloated, grotesque form. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though whether it was to Hannah or himself, she couldn't tell. He fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the construction site, and the Queen let out an ear-splitting screech, its body convulsing violently as the bullet tore through its flesh. The spiderlings scattered, their frenzied skittering filling the air as the webbing began to tremble, collapsing around them. But the Queen wasn't dead. Not yet. With a final desperate scream, it lunged at them, its massive body crashing through the webbing, its legs thrashing wildly as it came down upon them. Hannah and her father dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's deadly limbs. Robert fired again and again, each shot driving the Queen further back, but it wasn't enough. Its rage was unstoppable, its monstrous form looming over them like a nightmare given flesh. In the chaos, Hannah spotted something, an exposed gas line running beneath the site. The construction had been abandoned before the work was completed, leaving pipes and wires jutting out from the ground like broken bones. "Dad! The gas line!" she shouted, her voice hoarse with fear. Robert followed her gaze, his eyes widening in understanding. Without hesitating, he fired one last shot, the bullet sparking against the metal pipe. The explosion was deafening. Flames erupted around them, consuming the nest. The Queen's massive body engulfed in the inferno as it screeched in agony, its limbs thrashing wildly before finally falling still. Hannah and her father scrambled away from the burning wreckage, their lungs burning from the smoke, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The ground shook beneath them, the tunnels collapsing as the fire spread, sealing the hive beneath the earth. For a long moment, they lay there, gasping for breath, watching as the flames devoured the nest, the skittering finally falling silent. It was over. But as Hannah stared at the smoldering remains of the construction site, her body aching with exhaustion, She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. And then, from the shadows, she saw it. A single spiderling, no larger than her hand, skittering away into the darkness, disappearing into the night.